I bought the watch back in 1987, the year my youngest was born, and I swore I'd wear it until they buried me. So when my son-in-law walked into my kitchen wearing one just like it, I nearly dropped my coffee cup. But that's getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a man who built a trucking empire out of a single rusted flatbed ended up sitting in a courtroom, pretending his mind was gone, waiting for my granddaughter to save my life. Before I get into it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had someone you loved try to convince you that you were the crazy one, hit that like button right now, because you're going to want to remember you did. My name is Walter Grissom. I'm 68 years old. I built Grissom Freight Lines from nothing but a busted-up '78 Peterbilt and a line of credit no bank should have given me. 41 years later, we run 600 trucks across 11 states. I have shaken hands with governors. I have negotiated with union bosses who'd sooner spit on you than shake your hand. I built calluses that never fully went away, even after I could afford to never lift another box in my life. But on the morning this story really begins, I was sitting in a family courtroom in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I could not stop my own hands from shaking. The room was cold in that particular way government buildings always are, like the air conditioning is set specifically to make you feel small. I sat at the defense table, staring down at my knuckles, watching them tremble against the varnished wood, and for the first time in my whole stubborn life, I was afraid of my own body. Across the aisle from me sat Renata. She was 47 years old, and she had been my wife for 14 years. She traded in the sequin dresses and the diamond tennis bracelet I bought her for our 10th anniversary for a plain gray blouse buttoned to the throat, her hair pulled back with no makeup except for something dabbed under her eyes to make them look raw and swollen. She was good. I'll give her that. She dabbed at her face with a balled-up tissue like she was barely holding herself together, and if I hadn't known her the way I did, I might have believed it myself. Beside her sat her lawyer, a slick man in a suit that cost more than my first truck, holding up a manila folder thick as a phone book like it was a loaded weapon. He told the judge, in a voice dripping with rehearsed sorrow, that my mind was deteriorating rapidly, that I had been diagnosed, quietly, by specialists Renata had consulted out of loving concern, with an aggressive and irreversible form of dementia, that I had become erratic, forgetful, at times violent, that I posed a danger not only to myself, but to everyone around me, especially to my granddaughter, who lived with us. I sat there and listened to a stranger describe a man I did not recognize, and the worst part, the absolute worst part, was that some small, terrified corner of my mind wondered if he was right, because it hadn't come from nowhere. 6 months before that morning, I was a different man. I ran 3 miles most mornings along the river trail behind our house. I could recite freight manifests from memory, negotiate a fuel contract without ever glancing at a spreadsheet. My son-in-law, Preston, had married my daughter Diane 11 years back, and after Diane passed from a sudden brain aneurysm 4 years ago, God rest her, Preston and his daughter Mabel, my granddaughter, 10 years old, the spitting image of Diane at that age had come to live in my house. I never questioned it. She was my blood. He was, in my mind, still family, even without Diane there to hold us together. I made him a vice president at Grissom Freight. I trusted him with contracts worth more than most men see in a lifetime. Then, about 6 months before that courtroom morning, I started forgetting things. Small things at first, a name here, a date there. Then my hands started to shake. Faint at first, then undeniable. I'd walk into a room and lose the thread of why I'd come. Once, God help me, I threw a stapler across my office at a young dispatcher over a scheduling error, and I stood there afterward not recognizing the rage that had just poured out of me like something with its own separate mind. Renata told me, gently, so gently, that I needed help, that I was scaring her, that I was scaring Mabel. And through it all, every single night, exactly 1 hour before bed, Renata brought me a tall glass of cranberry juice mixed with a wellness tonic, she said her doctor in Scottsdale had recommended for my blood pressure. She stood over me while I drank it, watching with those soft, worried eyes, refusing to let the housekeeper prepare it, insisting it had to be her hands that made it, because she loved me, because she was scared of losing me. I drank it every night like a good and grateful husband. I never once thought to ask why the bottom of the glass always had a faint gray residue I had to scrub out myself. 2 weeks before the divorce papers came, Preston showed up at my office unannounced, which he never did, with a stack of documents he called routine authorizations. My hands were shaking so badly that day I could barely hold the pen. He stood over my shoulder, patient as a saint. guiding my hand to the signature lines, telling me not to worry about the details, that he'd handle everything, that all I needed to do was rest. I signed every page. I didn't read a word of it. God help me. I couldn't have read it if I'd tried. The letters swam on the page like minnows. 3 days later, I came home from what I thought was a routine doctor's visit to find the gate code changed. My suitcases were stacked on the porch like garbage waiting for pickup. Renata's face appeared briefly in the upstairs window, and then Preston stepped out onto the porch instead, arms crossed, wearing an expression of manufactured pity so convincing I almost believed he meant it. "Walter," he said, shaking his head slowly, "you really shouldn't be driving in your condition. We've all seen it. The confusion, the outbursts. This is for your own protection. And for Mabel's." I gripped the iron rail of the porch steps until my knuckles went white. "This is my house," I told him. "I built this house with my own 2 hands before you were old enough to shave." "I know you believe that," he said, with that same sickening gentleness. "But your grip on reality isn't what it used to be, Walter. The papers are already filed. The judge has already reviewed the medical assessments. We've arranged a very comfortable place for you to stay while you get better. Your bags are packed. You don't need to worry about anything anymore." And that's when I saw her, up in the second-floor window, past Preston's shoulder, Mabel, pressing her small palms flat against the glass, her face white as chalk, her eyes locked on mine with a kind of terror I will never, as long as I live, be able to forget. I opened my mouth to call her name. Before a sound could leave me, a shadow moved behind her, and Renata's hand closed roughly over Mabel's shoulder and yanked her backward out of sight. The curtain fell shut like a door slamming on my whole life. A car Preston had arranged took me to a long-stay hotel outside downtown Tulsa. All beige walls and recycled air, empty of anything that had ever meant something to me. I sat on the edge of that stiff, hotel-cornered bed with my 6 suitcases lined up by the door like tombstones, and I held my hands out in front of me and watched them tremble, and I thought, God help me. Maybe they're right. Maybe I really am losing my mind. That night the phone on the nightstand rang, and it was Renata, her voice soft as a lullaby, dripping with sorrow. "Walter, darling, I am so sorry it had to be this way. I cry myself to sleep every night watching you disappear. But you frightened Mabel, Walter. You don't remember the things you do, but they're terrifying, and I have to protect her." She told me Preston would be sending over temporary guardianship papers, just a formality, just something to let them manage things while I rested. She told me to sign it for Mabel's sake. And God forgive me, sitting in that beige room with my hands shaking and my whole identity dissolving, I was ready to sign anything just to make the noise in my head stop. 2 days later, the court granted a single hour of supervised visitation in a public park. I got there an hour early and sat on a bench watching the entrance, my heart hammering. When the SUV finally pulled up, Mabel climbed out wearing the yellow raincoat I'd bought her the previous spring. But she seemed smaller somehow, folded in on herself, walking with her chin tucked to her chest. She wouldn't run to me the way she used to. She just stood a few feet away and said, "Hi, Grandpa," in a voice barely above a whisper, her eyes darting constantly toward Renata, who stood by the fence in dark sunglasses like a hawk watching a field mouse. We sat at a picnic table. I asked about her 4th-grade class, about the fantasy books we used to read together on the porch swing. She answered in one word at a time. Yes. No. It's okay. When I reached over to still her restless, cuticle-picking hands, she flinched at my touch, and something in my chest cracked wide open. When the social worker announced our time was up, I stood, my knees aching, and told Mabel I would never stop fighting for her. She stood frozen for one long second, and then she broke and ran into my arms, burying her face in my coat. I dropped to my knees and held her, breathing in the smell of her shampoo. And in that one blessed second, while my body shielded her from Renata's sightline, I felt her small hand slide into the pocket of my jacket and press something deep inside the lining. "That's enough, Walter." Renata's voice cut across the park like a whip, and she marched over on her heels and physically pulled Mabel away from me, dragging her back toward the SUV while the social worker stepped between us like a human fence. I knelt there on the cold grass and watched the vehicle pull away, my right hand hovering over my jacket pocket, feeling the faint outline of something small and folded pressed against my ribs. I didn't dare pull it out in the open. I walked briskly to the public restroom near the recreation center, locked myself in the last stall, and with trembling hands unfolded a torn scrap of notebook paper, in pencil. in my granddaughter's careful, terrified 10-year-old handwriting, were 8 words that split my whole world open down the middle. Grandpa, don't drink the cranberry juice anymore. I stood in that restroom until the fluorescent light started to blur, and something ancient and cold woke up inside me. I had spent 41 years reading men across a negotiating table, and every one of those instincts came roaring back at once. I thought back over the last 6 months, the fog that never struck in the afternoon but always rolled in an hour after that glass of cranberry juice. The outbursts that always happened deep at night. The tremors that eased, faintly, on the mornings I'd skipped my nightly drink because I'd fallen asleep too fast at my desk. It had never been dementia. It had been her hands, every night, pouring something into my glass while she smiled at me like a devoted wife. I hadn't had a drop of that juice in 3 days. I held my hands out flat in the harsh restroom light, and they were steady, not a single tremor. My whole body was already starting to heal itself, and along with it came a rage, colder and more patient than anything I'd ever felt in a boardroom. I did not go back and scream at anyone. I did something worse. I played along. Back at the hotel, I sat in the dark and traced the pattern with a clear head for the first time in 6 months. Cranberry juice, every night, 1 hour before bed, only ever prepared by Renata's own hand. I remembered, too, a strange detail I'd let slide past me weeks earlier, Renata coming back from a wellness retreat in Sedona, right around the time the tremors first began, talking about a naturopath who'd recommended a custom tonic for my heart. I had trusted her so completely I never thought to question a single word of it. At 2 in the morning, I opened my laptop. I am not a foolish man, whatever they wanted the judge to believe. Long before Preston ever set foot in Grissom Freight, I'd kept a private backdoor login into our financial systems, an old habit from the days I didn't trust anybody with the keys to my own company, set up by a computer whiz I'd once bailed out of a bad debt in exchange for a favor he'd never forgotten. I logged in as a ghost, invisible to anyone watching the system, and started pulling the documents Preston had walked me through, signing at the office 2 weeks before. They weren't routine authorizations. They were wire transfer approvals, millions of dollars, funneled out of Grissom Freight's operating accounts into a string of shell companies registered out of Nevada, with names like Cascade Logistics Partners and Redstone Capital Holdings, all filed under the vague banner of emergency legal and consulting expenses. 4 million here, 6 million there. Another 5, gone into a company that had been incorporated exactly 6 months earlier, right around the time my cranberry juice started tasting a little different. Preston wasn't just angling to take over the company on paper. He was bleeding it dry while everyone thought I was the one losing my grip. I did not call the police. I did not confront him. Instead, I drove 3 hours across the state line into Kansas the next morning and found the office of a man named Earl Tibbetts, the toughest, meanest attorney I had ever worked with, retired now, or so everyone believed, running a quiet little practice out of a strip mall that nobody who mattered would ever think to look at. I laid the printouts on his desk and told him everything, the divorce, the gaslighting, the note in my pocket, the trembling hands that had gone steady the second I stopped drinking Renata's juice. Earl took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and said, "Walter, you don't need a divorce lawyer. You need an executioner." "Then help me build one," I told him. Over the next several days, Earl drafted an ironclad trust to move every dollar I still had left, every piece of property, completely out of Preston's reach, before he could drain another account. He had contacts inside the State Banking Commission from decades of old favors, and he flagged the shell companies for suspected fraud, quietly tying a live wire straight from those Nevada accounts to a federal investigation neither Preston nor Renata would ever see coming. Earl told me the same thing his old-timer instincts had been screaming since the beginning. Keep playing the broken old man. Let them feel powerful. The higher they climb, the harder the fall. So I did. I let my hands shake at the next mediation meeting. I let a pen clatter off the table in front of Renata's lawyer, my voice cracking as I mumbled that my head hurt, that I just wanted to rest, that if this was what would keep Mabel safe, I would consider signing anything. I watched them exchange a private, triumphant glance across the table, believing they had finally broken me completely. The moment I stepped outside those glass doors, my spine straightened, and I drove directly to a private clinic 2 counties over under a false name, paid in cash, and gave blood and hair samples for a comprehensive toxicology panel, the kind that reads a man's chemical history the way tree rings read the seasons. While I waited on those results, I hired a man named Denny Ruiz, an old army buddy of one of my longtime drivers, who did quiet, careful surveillance work for people who needed it done invisibly. I told Denny to ignore Renata entirely. She was too careful, too controlled to slip. Preston was the weak link. Preston liked being seen, liked being admired, liked wearing things that told the world he'd already won. Denny planted small recording devices in Preston's car and inside his office at Grissom Freight within 48 hours. The toxicology results came back on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Dr. Okafor, the toxicologist, called me himself instead of just mailing the report, his voice heavy with the particular gravity of a man about to deliver terrible news. My hair samples showed a slow, deliberate escalation of heavy metals and a synthetic sedative compound, not typically found on standard drug panels, a chemical cocktail meticulously calibrated over 6 months to mimic the exact symptoms of a rapidly advancing neurological disease. If it had continued another 2 months, Dr. Okafor told me quietly, my heart or my mind would have failed permanently, and there would have been no undoing it. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long time after he hung up, staring at my own steady hands, and I understood, with total clarity, that this had never been a divorce. It had been an execution, carried out 1 glass of cranberry juice at a time. Denny brought me the recordings 2 days later. I plugged in the drive with hands that no longer shook and put on a pair of headphones, bracing myself for financial talk, wire transfer logistics, whatever cold business language I imagined Preston used to describe robbing me blind. Instead, I heard Preston's office door close, a deadbolt turning, and then Renata's voice low, familiar in a way that made my stomach drop through the floor, saying his name in a tone I hadn't heard directed at me in years. I sat frozen in that hotel chair and listened to the two of them together, my wife and my dead daughter's husband, laughing between breaths about how easy I had been to fool. Renata described, in loving, almost affectionate detail, exactly how she crushed the pills in a marble mortar every night and stirred them into my juice, marveling at how well the tartness of the cranberry hid the bitterness. Preston laughed and told her how satisfying it had been watching me drop that pen at mediation, knowing he was the one who'd put the tremor there. I had to stop the recording twice to be sick in the hotel bathroom sink. But I made myself listen to every second, because I needed to know everything they were planning. And what they were planning was worse than anything I had imagined. The Nevada shell companies were a prelude to something bigger. Preston was quietly negotiating to sell off Grissom Freight's most profitable regional routes to Halloran Transit Group, my company's oldest and most bitter competitor, for a fraction of their real value, in exchange for a personal kickback of $18 million wired into an account in the Caymans. He planned to manufacture a fake financial crisis using my mental decline as the excuse, panic the board into approving the sale, and vanish with Renata to a property they'd already purchased outside of Panama City before anyone could trace the money. And then came the part that turned my blood to ice water. "What do we do about the kid?" Preston asked. And I heard Renata sigh like Mabel was an inconvenience, a scheduling conflict. "I've already looked into a boarding school outside of Billings," Renata said, flat and cold, nothing like the trembling, devoted wife she played in that courtroom. "Strict program, out of state, limited contact. Once Walter's declared incompetent, I'll have full custodial authority, and I can ship her off before anyone asks questions. And if that falls through, I'll sign the guardianship over to the state. I am done playing mother to somebody else's grief." I sat in that beige hotel room with tears running silently down my face, not for myself, but for a 10-year-old girl who had risked everything, slipping a note into an old man's pocket to save his life, only to be discussed like luggage nobody wanted to carry anymore. I did not wait out the 5 days Earl and I had planned. I called him that same night and told him to spring every trap we had built, immediately. The following morning, I sat back at that same defense table in the same cold courtroom, my posture deliberately slumped, my hands folded and still in my lap, the same tired suit hanging off my shoulders. Renata and Preston sat across the aisle looking like the picture of a grieving, exhausted family. Their attorney rose and delivered his opening remarks with theatrical sorrow, praising my 4 decades building Grissom Freight, before pivoting into a devastating account of my supposed collapse, the tremors, the outbursts, the confusion asking the court to grant full and permanent guardianship of both my estate and my granddaughter to my devoted wife and son-in-law. Preston took the stand and delivered a performance for the ages, describing with a trembling voice how much he loved me, how it broke his heart to watch me deteriorate, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief while he lied under federal oath with a fluency that made my skin crawl. I sat and let him dig his own grave with a golden shovel because I already knew that every recording, every toxicology report, every shell company wire transfer was sitting in Earl's briefcase 2 rows behind me, ready to be unsealed. The judge, a tired man with silver hair, listened with visible pity written across his face, gathering the guardianship papers, reaching for his gavel to end my life as a free man without ever knowing the trial hadn't truly started yet. And then, from the back of the courtroom, a small voice rang out. "Wait. Please wait." Every head turned. Standing in the aisle, clutching a battered tablet against her chest, was Mabel, a stern-faced court advocate at her side. She looked impossibly small in that enormous room, but her eyes were burning with something fierce and unbreakable. "May I show you something Grandpa doesn't know about, Your Honor?" Renata shot up out of her chair with a scream, lunging across the aisle toward Mabel. But the bailiff caught her before she made it 2 steps, forcing her back into her seat. The judge's pity dissolved instantly into sharp, cold suspicion at the sheer terror written across Renata's face. He waved off the opposing attorney's frantic objections and gently told Mabel to approach. The bailiff connected her tablet to the courtroom screens. The footage that appeared was grainy but unmistakable. Our kitchen. Filmed from a strange low angle, I recognized after a moment as the glass eye of the stuffed rabbit Mabel kept on the windowsill, the one I'd won her at the county fair 3 summers back. The timestamp in the corner read 3 months prior. Renata walked into frame in her silk robe, reached behind the vitamin bottles in the cabinet, and pulled out a small amber vial. The courtroom watched in horrified silence as she crushed pills in a marble mortar and stirred the powder into a tall glass of cranberry juice with the same casual rhythm she used to hum along to the radio. The kitchen door opened. Preston walked in, slid his arms around her waist from behind, and they kissed, long and unhurried, right there over the very glass meant for my nightstand. Preston pulled back, glancing at the poisoned glass with a slow, satisfied smile, and said the words that would end him. "Once the old man's mind is completely gone, you sign the company straight over to me." The screen went black. The courtroom fell into a silence so total I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I turned my head and watched the color drain out of Renata's face until she looked like a woman carved from wax. Preston sat frozen, his mouth working soundlessly, the confident executive mask sliding off him in real time. I rose slowly from the defense table. My hands were steady, my spine was straight. I gave a single nod to Earl, who stood, opened his briefcase, and laid the toxicology reports, the wire transfer records, and the offshore banking traces down on the judge's bench with a thud that seemed to echo for a full minute. "Your Honor," Earl said, his voice cutting clean through the chaos rippling across the gallery. "My client is not suffering from dementia. He is the victim of a calculated, months-long poisoning, financial fraud, and attempted murder." The back doors of the courtroom swung open, and 2 federal agents walked in, having been quietly briefed by Earl 3 days earlier. Preston bolted for the side exit and made it exactly 3 steps before the bailiff tackled him to the marble floor. Renata collapsed back into her chair, screaming that it was all a misunderstanding, reaching for that same soft, poisonous voice she'd once used on me in a hotel room, and I did not give her the satisfaction of even looking her way. The judge slammed his gavel down, revoked every temporary order Renata had ever been granted, awarded me full and immediate custody of Mabel, and signed the federal arrest warrants without a moment's hesitation. I watched the handcuffs close around the wrists of the woman I had loved and the boy I had trusted like a son, and I felt no triumph in it, only a hollow, exhausted relief. I walked over, knelt down in front of the witness stand, and pulled my granddaughter into my arms as she finally let herself cry, both of us shaking now, but for entirely different reasons than before. I lost a wife and the closest thing I had to a son that day, but I got my life back. I saved my company, and most importantly, I saved the only family I had left standing. Betrayal rarely wears the face of a stranger. More often, it sits across the dinner table from you, calling you honey, pouring your evening drink with a loving smile. If there is one thing I have learned in 68 years of building something out of nothing, it's this: the moment someone insists you can no longer trust your own mind, that is the exact moment you must trust it hardest. Protect your legacy. Protect the people who depend on you. And never, ever mistake a devoted performance for a devoted heart. If this story kept you up past your bedtime tonight, hit that like button and subscribe before you go. Have you ever had someone try to convince you that you were the one losing your grip on reality? Tell me how you fought your way back in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one.